No story is complete without a compelling villain, and throughout the history of the Final Fantasy franchise, there have been some fantastic examples of this. Sephiroth is arguably the poster child here in terms of sheer popularity, but I'd say that none quite embody what it means to be a villain like Kefka Palazzo, the main antagonist of Final Fantasy VI. He was initially conceived by Yoshitaka Amano, who, after working on the character designs for the previous 5 games, was given the brief to create characters for Final Fantasy VI who felt real and alive. And after seeing what he'd come up with, Yoshinori Kitase started to think about how he could bring the character to life within the scenario. And a critical decision around Kefka's first scene in the game would have a huge impact on the character we would end up with. Kitase felt it would be far too boring to make the scene act like a normal introduction for the character, so to try and highlight that there were maybe a few screws loose within Kefka's mind, he wrote in that an accompanying soldier would dust off his shoes despite them being in the middle of a desert. It was completely off the cuff, with Kitase just following his intuition, but it paved the way for how Kefka's personality was woven into the rest of the story. As he noted in a blog post on 1UP in preparation for the launch of Dissidia, if he hadn't made that change, Kefka would have likely ended up being a completely different type of character. In the grand scheme of things, it was a small change, but it helped to add an extra dimension to Kefka's character. Yes, he was cold, callous and ruthless, but then so were many of the other generals and soldiers that were part of the Gestahlian Empire. What separated him was the fact that he was also completely off his rocker, and despite many of his own forces being very wary of him, the Emperor kind of liked this about Kefka. He indulged Kefka's nefarious behaviour, and it's why we got to witness so many fantastic scenes as the scenario of Final Fantasy VI progressed. If Kefka was just pure evil, it's doubtful the impact of his actions would have been quite so significant, and it's also doubtful that he would have gained such a fan following. Because I mean, truth be told, ever since we did our first Origins video on Sephiroth some time ago now, we've been inundated with requests for us to dive into the backstory of Kefka, and that was only amplified when we published our video on Terra earlier this year. The wait is now over though, so get prepared to sit back, relax, and enjoy this rather crazy roller coaster of woe, emotional torment, and deliverance. Before we do dive into Kefka's origins though, I just want to remind everyone that even if you are already subscribed to Final Fantasy Union, make sure you hit that notification button to make sure you get notified when we publish new content. And make sure you let us know in the comments who you'd like us to cover in a future Origins video. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's get started with Kefka's origins. Kefka was born on the 19th of November, 35 years prior to when the events of Final Fantasy VI took place. But little is known about his formative years, other than the fact he became an orphan at a very young age. The exact location of this orphanage is unknown, but it's believed to have been in or around Vector, as Kefka joined the military of the Gestahlian Empire, which was headquartered in Vector when he was only a teenager. During this time, the Empire was going through some significant changes. Gestahl had risen to power, and he had grand visions of what the Empire could become. But unlike his predecessors, his ambition wasn't just constrained to the consolidation of power. Instead, he wanted to look further afield in terms of both the acquisition of new territory and the power he would need in order to both conquer and then rule his new conquests. Upon then finding the Esper world and abducting some of the Espers found within, Gestahl had exactly what he needed. He just didn't quite understand how to use it. The Magitech research facility was therefore established to try and unlock the secrets of this new source of power, and Cid was placed in command. In the years that followed, Kefka started to rise through the military ranks, and he gained a reputation for being a fearsome warrior. And due to his reputation, he became a prime candidate for Cid's inaugural Magitech Knight experiment. This would see Cid attempt to forcibly extract magic from an Esper and imbue it into a human, making them incredibly powerful and a valuable asset to the Imperial army. Cid felt it would be absolutely possible, and he was right, as after completing the experiment on Kefka, he did become magic infused. But there was a horrible side effect, as the injection of magic power shattered Kefka's psyche and filled him with a hunger for chaos and destruction. Kefka before the experiment was a valuable asset to the Empire, but Kefka after the experiment was an entirely different proposition. Gestahl saw this change and it thrilled him. He became convinced that the experiment was, for the most part, a success, and it led to a restructuring of the Gestahlian military. Kefka was promoted to being one of the more senior figures within the military under the wider command of Leo Christophe, and he was effectively given carte blanche to do whatever he pleased, as long, of course, as it helped Gestahl to achieve his wider ambitions. Realizing the power that could be harnessed, Kefka then became heavily invested in magitech research and often used new emerging technologies in his military campaigns. One important example was the use of magitech armor, which played an important role in their conquest of the Western continent, but another example related to a specific individual who had a natural affinity with magic. During their invasion of the Esper world, Gestahl had managed to capture a half-human, half-Esper girl who was named Terra. She was raised within the confines of the palace and subjected to horrible experiments as the Empire looked to learn more about her abilities, and having presumably become tired of the progress, Kefka decided to take things to the next level. Having learnt a great deal about magitech technology at this point, Kefka was able to construct a device called the Slave Crown, which when placed upon an individual's head would allow him to control their actions. Realizing the potential Terra had, Kefka sought to use it for his own personal gain, and after placing the Slave Crown on Terra's head, he gained unfiltered access to one of the Empire's ultimate weapons. Keen to test out just how powerful Terra was, Kefka sanctioned a battle to the death against 50 of his own soldiers who were each using magitech armor. It was no contest though. Terra wiped them all out within 3 minutes, burning them alive. It served as the justification Kefka needed, and he became even more obsessed with magitech, something which Gestahl continued to indulge. But the rank and file within the army started to become incredibly fearful of Kefka. He had almost no regard for human life, no matter which side of the conflict they were on, nor would he ever show any remorse for the atrocities he would commit in the pursuit of his goals. Attempting to seek out more power, Kefka began to hunt the land at the behest of Gestahl for more espers, and after finding out about a frozen esper called Valigarmander, which had been found near Nash, Kefka sent a small team to covertly acquire it without raising suspicion, as Nash was a neutral territory. Much to his annoyance, the plan failed. Biggs and Wedge were annihilated by the now awakened esper, Terra was freed from the control of the Slave Crown, and Nash became aware that Gestahl had been acting against their peace accord. Gestahl was less than amused by this failure, and he sent Kefka to clean up his mess, or at least that's how it appeared. In reality, they were keen for the returners to have Terra on their side, as they knew she would eventually try to open the sealed gate to the Esper world. They therefore used this opportunity to enact some wider plans. Despite being publicly allied with the Empire, there had been rumours floating around that Figaro were aiding their enemies, and when Kefka heard that Terra may be being harboured at Figaro Castle, he decided to exploit this to the full, using them as an example to those who thought about betraying the Empire. When he confronted Edgar, he laid the charade on thick. Then, hoping to catch them unawares, Kefka ordered his men to set fire to Figaro Castle, wanting to make them suffer. But he was outfoxed by Edgar. The castle only suffered minor damage thanks to the carefully planned strategy that was employed by Edgar and his Chancellor, and Edgar managed to escape along with Terra and Locke. This infuriated Kefka, as Edgar and the rest of Figaro had made a mockery of him with their actions. But he wouldn't have to wait long before he could enact a swift retribution to heal his wounded pride, as Gestahl ordered the Imperial army to assault the Kingdom of Doma. This assault was led by General Leo, with Kefka making up part of the wider attack force, and this conflict served to show how disparate the two senior military figures were. Once upon a time, Kefka had actually looked up to Leo, but after Sid's experiment, he had become more and more frustrated with Leo's pointless sense of chivalry, and rumours were swirling around that Kefka was plotting against Leo behind his back so that he could take complete command of the Imperial forces. In this particular conflict, Leo looked to try and reduce casualties. He was confident that victory was within their grasp, and by employing patience, he wanted to ensure that whatever strategy he used would prevent the loss of life on both sides. But when Leo was conveniently summoned away by Gestahl before any strategy could be implemented, Kefka happily assumed command of the military for this particular campaign, and patience and indeed loss of life were very low on his list of priorities. Almost immediately, he ordered a complete change in their offensive strategy. He wasn't prepared to let Doma wait things out behind their high walls, and he ordered his men to poison the castle's water supply. It was an extreme action, and there were protestations from the men, not least due to the backhanded nature of the attack, but because they were Gestahlian prisoners who would also likely perish as a result of the attack. These concerns, though, led to nothing but a short rebuttal from Kefka. He sharply accused those captured of negligence for being captured in the first place, suggesting that they deserved to die for their failures. And even though both Shadow and Sabin, who had been eavesdropping on the whole affair, attempted to stop Kefka, they were too late. Doma was done for. There were an extreme number of casualties due to Kefka's cruel deed, and Cyan, the kingdom's noble protector, lost both his wife Elaine and his son Owain. But with that problem resolved rather quickly, Kefka turned his attentions back to the frozen esper called Valigarmander that had been dug up on the outskirts of Narshe. Unlike before, where secrecy was a lot more important, things were now different. Military excursions against Figura and Doma had signalled the Empire's intent, and Kefka took full advantage. He ordered a full-scale attack on Narshe, who had until this point still remained neutral. As he had done in Doma, Kefka decided to show flagrant interest in the preservation of life, as he ordered his men to kill everyone, including civilians. Anything was permissible as long as they retrieved the Esper. Narshe then readied itself for war, and the returners who came offering their assistance chose to guard the frozen Esper. They would make their last stand on the Narshe cliffs. Kefka was rather delighted about this. He would have the chance to rid the world of his pesky adversaries, including the recent traitor General Celes, and to that end, he personally joined the conflict. Kefka was thwarted by their combined strength though, and despite having the odds in his favour, he was forced to withdraw. It meant that Kefka had now suffered 2 humiliations in quick succession, and he decided to return to Vector to try and plan his new evil scheme, to revive the warring triad, and to become a god. This led him to return to the Magitech research facility so that he could start extracting more powers from the Espers that they had captured years prior. But he realised that he would need even more Espers to achieve his goals, and so he started to plot as to how they could be obtained. But when Kefka then saw the Espers sacrifice themselves to grant the returners their power, a process which created Magicite, his plan changed. The power they had been able to extract at the Magitech research facility was minor in comparison to what was being housed within the Magicite, and he realised that this would be much more efficient if he was to become all-powerful. That was, if he could get his hands on the Magicite, because it had to be a voluntary act, and he wasn't exactly on friendly terms with the Espers, having been torturing them for years. Kefka therefore decided to play out a little ruse that he'd been working on regarding to General Celes since they last met. Even though her betrayal of the Empire was real, due to her previous rank within the military, Kefka knew that there would always be question marks amongst his new allies. He had therefore started to plant a rumour that Celes was in fact a spy, and his plan played out perfectly. First, Cid mentioned it as if it were fact, and Kefka then ordered Celes to hand over the Magicite and acted as if her being a spy was a regular action that they would employ. Even though Celes then refused, the damage was already done. Locke was shocked. Their relationship would never be the same again, and he wasn't even able to bear witness to Celes's unselfish act as she used her power as a Magitech knight to stop Kefka from killing them. This wasn't part of Kefka's plan, and it resulted in significant damage to the Magitech research facility, and Kefka couldn't just let such insolence slide, and he decided to try and teach them a lesson, but they still escaped anyway, and after this minor incident, Kefka went back to the Emperor's overarching plan, to try and be patient, hoping that Terra would open the sealed gate, something that she did not too long after. Kefka pounced on the opportunity. It was everything he had been hoping for. but even he was stunned by what emerged. Pent up with years of rage, the Espers were spurring for a fight, and they sacked the land. Thinking about how to use this situation to his advantage, Gestahl then imprisoned Kefka supposedly for his part in everything that had happened to date. But this too was also a ruse, even if Kefka wasn't initially kept in the loop. General Leo was sent as a show of faith that the Empire was sincere, but in secret, Gestahl released Kefka from prison and sent him to turn all the Espers into magicite for their nefarious schemes. There was no care given to collateral damage in this exercise, and although General Leo decided it was finally time to stand up to Kefka, it was unfortunately too late. Leo had always chosen to avoid magic infusion, and he was now no match for Kefka, especially with his new powers thanks to the fresh magicite he'd gained. After the defeat of Leo, and feeling that the land was in grave danger, more Espers rushed out to try and stop Kefka, but they were just lambs for the slaughter. Kefka turned them all into magicite and became even more powerful. After completing such a successful mission, Kefka reported back to Gestahl, and he continued to try and play along as the doting underling as they found the warring triad and created the floating continent. Kefka, for once, had shown remarkable patience. He had played along with the Emperor's schemes for some time, and after allowing the Emperor to bask in the glory of his victory, it was finally time to actually strike. Well, after he'd had a little fun, of course. After being approached by the returners on the floating continent, Gestahl subdued them all except Celes, as he'd always had a soft spot for his former general. Seeing this opportunity though, Kefka requested that Celes should kill her comrades to absolve her sins, but she chose to stab him instead. The ignominy! This act enraged Kefka, and he decided that now was the time to finally enact his overarching plan. Despite protest from Gestahl, Kefka rushed into the field of the warring triad and became immune to Gestahl's subsequent attacks. He then turned the tables, summoning forth the warring triad's power, and Gestahl finally realised that Kefka had been playing him the entire time. Shadow desperately tried to stop Kefka from enacting the final part of his plan, but it was too late. Kefka had achieved his goals. He had won, and after absorbing the power of the warring triad, he became a god. In the year that followed, Kefka began crafting his new domain. Using remnants from the world he had destroyed, Kefka constructed Kefka's Tower, a monstrous structure that could be used to surveil his pitiful subjects. And if any were to step out of line, he would smite them using the light of judgment, which would rain down fiery hell from the tower, able to even destroy entire towns if required. Kefka also created numerous monsters, many of whom were tasked with protecting his tower should anyone be foolish enough to try and rise up against him. During this time, the returners, who had tried to thwart Kefka so many times in the past, had begun to seek each other out, but Kefka had been watching and waiting. He knew that they would attempt to square off against him yet again, and he had given himself plenty of time to prepare for their inevitable showdown. And when this showdown happened, first he wanted to impart some philosophies that he'd been mulling over. Kefka had become tired of witnessing people attempting to live and build something for themselves, even though it would inevitably die, and whatever they'd built would be inevitably destroyed. He wanted to rain down terror and misery to try and break the spirits of those who had survived. But what he didn't realise was that he'd actually given them the perfect world in which they could truly find within themselves the reasons that they wanted to keep on living and keep on fighting. And when he learnt this infuriated Kefka, and he vowed to just end the world outright so that people wouldn't have anything left to dream about anymore. But first, he would need to finally remove his pesky adversaries from the equation. Except, even with his incredible power, he still ultimately failed. Upon his defeat, due to the synergy that Kefka had had with the land, the world he had constructed started to fall apart and magic disappeared. It meant that for everything Kefka thought he had achieved, he ultimately achieved nothing. Everything he had built ended up being destroyed, and the people regained their hope. From the seeds of despair came new life and new dreams. And so, that concludes the story of Kefka, a character who for me epitomizes what it truly means to be a villain. As with many of the villains who have appeared throughout the history of the Final Fantasy franchise, Kefka had rather grand visions of what he could achieve in his life, and how much misery he could impose on people. But unlike many of his peers, he actually achieved his goals. He won. Sure, he did ultimately lose a year later, but that still shouldn't be understated. And I think that's part of why Kefka is such an interesting character. Another reason is that there was so much subterfuge that revolved around his story. Even though he comes across as this often comical man who's both heinously evil and ridiculous at the same time, it's sometimes easy to forget that behind all of this, there was a scheming mastermind. He had clearly been plotting against Gestahlian for some time, but while he was often portrayed as being very impulsive, there were other aspects to his personality. Comparisons have therefore been made with the Joker for this reason, and Square Enix have even stoked this fire with how he was represented within the Dissidia franchise, and I think those comparisons are fair, and it doesn't diminish Kefka's character though in my eyes. The only thing that I felt was perhaps missing with Kefka was a grand finale after the final battle. Sure, Kefka did indeed win during the story, and he got to become all-knowing and all-seeing, but upon the conclusion of the final battle, we didn't even get a line of dialogue, and I felt this was a shame. It could have told us much more about just how broken Kefka was. Would he repent or be steadfast in his convictions of wanting to ruin the world? I guess we'll never know. But yeah, with that small analysis out of the way, that marks the end of this Origins video. If you've made it this far, make sure you give yourself a customary pat on the back in the comments, and if you enjoyed it, be sure to hit that like button, share the video around to all the people you know who love Final Fantasy VI, and why not subscribe to our channel. Also be sure to let us know what you thought about the video, and feel free to let us know what Kefka means to you as a character. Why not also consider supporting us on Patreon? You will get the satisfaction of knowing that you're helping to support us in the creation of these videos, and we will reward you by, amongst other things, putting your name at the end of our videos like these guys you're seeing right now. Alright guys, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the lore of Final Fantasy VI. This is Daryl, signing out. I will see you all next time for more Final Fantasy videos.